The coffee was still warm when I heard the door close. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I remember checking the time because I always did. Mark had been leaving earlier and earlier these past few weeks, and I developed this habit of noting the exact moment he walked out. I don't know why. Something in my chest told me to keep track. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the steam rise from my mug and listened to his car pull out of the driveway. The sound of the engine fading into the distance felt different now. Everything felt different. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when things started to change between us. Maybe it wasn't sudden at all. Maybe I just finally opened my eyes. We'd been married for 17 years. 17 years of what I thought was a good life, a comfortable life. We had the house with the white shutters that we picked out together when we were younger and still believed that choosing the right paint color could guarantee forever. We had the 2 kids, now teenagers, who barely noticed us anymore. We had the routines, the patterns, the way Mark would kiss the top of my head before he left for work, the way I'd have dinner ready even though we rarely ate together anymore. But lately, something had shifted. It started small, a phone that he'd suddenly started keeping face down on the table, text notifications that would make him stand up and walk into another room, coming home later than usual with explanations that were just vague enough to not quite fit together. He was working on a big project at the office. One of his colleagues was going through something difficult. There were meetings running late, budget reviews, conference calls with the West Coast office. I'd nodded and accepted every explanation. I was good at that. I was good at being the wife who didn't ask too many questions, the wife who kept things running smoothly, the wife who pretended not to notice the distance growing between us like a slow crack in glass. But there was something about the way he looked at his phone now, something about the small smile that would cross his face when he thought no one was watching, something about the shower he'd take the moment he got home, washing away whatever the day had been, or whoever. I didn't want to think about that last part, but it was there, living in my chest, growing heavier every day. That Tuesday evening after Mark left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The coffee went cold in my hands. My daughter was upstairs doing homework. My son was in the basement playing video games. The house was full of people, but I felt completely alone. And in that loneliness, something shifted inside me. I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I grabbed my purse and my keys. I didn't let myself think about what I was doing. I just followed. The drive to downtown took about 15 minutes. I kept a safe distance, the way I'd seen people do in movies, though this felt surreal and wrong and necessary all at the same time. Mark's silver sedan was easy to follow. I knew that car the way I knew the sound of his breathing when he slept. I traveled in that car to 1,000 destinations. Now I was tracking it like it was evidence. He pulled into a parking garage on 5th Street, the nice part of town, the part with the upscale restaurants and the boutique shops, the part we didn't usually go to because Mark always said it was too expensive, too pretentious. I parked 2 rows over and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. When I saw him get out of the car, I didn't immediately follow. I sat there breathing, trying to prepare myself for what I might be about to learn. There was still time to turn around. There was still time to go home and pretend I'd never left, to go back to not knowing, to go back to the comfortable lie we'd been living. But I couldn't do that anymore. I got out of the car and walked toward the elevator banks. I could see Mark ahead of me, and he was moving with a purpose I hadn't seen in him in months. His shoulders were back. There was a spring in his step. He looked alive in a way that made my heart break all over again. The elevator doors closed before I could get there. I stood in front of the closed doors, watching the numbers climb. Floor 3, floor 4, floor 5. It stopped at floor 7. There was a directory near the elevators. I moved toward it slowly, like someone walking through a dream. Floor 7 held a dozen different businesses, legal offices, a marketing firm, an accounting company, a small fitness studio. Nothing that would have brought Mark here, nothing that made sense. I pressed the elevator button and waited for the next car. When I reached the 7th floor, I stepped out cautiously into a pristine hallway. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet you get in office buildings after most people have gone home. The hallway stretched in both directions. I could hear the faint sound of music coming. From one direction, from the fitness studio maybe, or somewhere else. I walked slowly, reading the names on the doors. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid someone would hear it. And then I saw him. Mark was standing outside a door marked Riverside Community Center, floor 7. He was talking to someone, and I couldn't see who at first because he was partially blocking the doorway. But then the person moved, and I saw. It was a woman. Not the kind of woman I'd expected to see. Not someone who looked like a threat or a temptation or any of the things my mind had been preparing me for. She was older than me, maybe a few years older. She had gray streaking through her dark hair, and she was wearing scrubs, medical scrubs. There was something tired about her face, but also something warm, something kind. And Mark was looking at her the way I hadn't seen him look at anyone in years. They went inside together, the door closed. I stood in the hallway, completely frozen. My mind was unable to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't the story I'd been telling myself in the drive here. This wasn't the narrative I'd prepared for. I should have left. I should have walked away and driven home and figured out how to handle this in some rational way. But instead, I did something that I'm not entirely proud of. I waited. I waited in that hallway for almost 40 minutes, sitting on a bench across from that door, pretending to look at my phone, feeling like a criminal, feeling like a stranger in my own life. When Mark came back out, he was alone. The woman didn't follow him. I watched him walk back toward the elevators, and his expression had changed. He looked quieter now, more thoughtful. There was something almost peaceful about his face. I waited until he'd gotten into the elevator before I approached the door. The sign on the glass read, Riverside Community Center, Mental Health Services and Support Groups. Below that were smaller letters listing various programs: grief counseling, addiction support, depression and anxiety groups, family crisis intervention. My hand was shaking when I pushed open the door. Inside was a small waiting area with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. The walls were painted a gentle blue-green, the color of calm. There was a reception desk, but it was empty. The office hours posted on the wall showed that evening sessions were in progress until 8 p.m. I could hear voices from behind a closed door. Not distinct words, but the murmur of people talking. Multiple people, a group. I stood there staring at that door, and the full weight of what I'd just discovered crashed over me like a wave. Mark wasn't having an affair. Mark was in therapy. The realization hit me so hard that I had to sit down. I actually had to sit down in one of those comfortable chairs in that softlit waiting room, and I put my head in my hands while the truth rewrote itself in my mind. Mark was struggling, Mark was suffering. Mark had been coming here to this place to talk to people about whatever was happening inside his head that he couldn't talk to me about, that he couldn't bring home, that he needed professional help to process. And I had been so convinced that he was betraying me that I'd followed him across town like some jealous, suspicious person. I'd turned my husband's pain into my own drama. I'd assumed the worst instead of asking. I'd let distance become my habit instead of reaching across it. I sat in that chair and I cried. Not angry tears, not tears of betrayal or suspicion, but tears of guilt and sadness and the sudden understanding of how lonely my husband must have been. How trapped, how unable to let me see what he was going through because I was the wife who didn't ask questions, the wife who accepted every explanation, the wife who had somehow made it impossible for him to come home and say, "I'm struggling, I need help." I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the voices from the back room started to shift, suggesting the group was wrapping up. I stood up quickly and walked back to the door, back toward the hallway, back toward the elevator. I didn't want Mark to come out and find me there. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out what to do with this information. The drive home was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Mark got home about 20 minutes after I did. He came in through the garage and I heard him set down his briefcase. I heard him move through the house. I heard him stop when he realized I was waiting for him in the living room, sitting in the dark. "Sarah," his voice was cautious. "What's wrong? Are the kids okay?" I stood up. I looked at my husband, really looked at him for the first time in months. I could see the exhaustion in his face. I could see the weight he'd been carrying. I could see all the words he'd been unable to say to me. "Mark," my voice sounded strange in my own ears. "I followed you tonight." I watched his face go pale. I watched his body tense, and then I continued before he could speak. "I followed you to the community center. I saw you go into the mental health services office. I read the sign. I understand now. I understand that you've been struggling with something, and instead of telling me, instead of letting me help, you've been going somewhere else. And I need you to know that I'm not angry. I'm not upset. I'm heartbroken that you felt like you couldn't tell me." He sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. His hands were shaking. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "About an hour since I followed you. And you're not upset." "I'm upset," I said, and I sat down next to him. "But not for the reasons I was this morning. I'm upset because I created a space in our marriage where you felt like you couldn't be honest with me. I'm upset because I've been so worried about holding things together that I didn't notice you were falling apart. I'm upset because I love you and you've been suffering and I had no idea." Mark started to cry. Not the kind of crying where you try to hold it together. The kind of crying where you finally let go of everything you've been holding up alone. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "Everything just got so heavy. Work was overwhelming and my dad's health got worse and I couldn't carry it anymore. I was waking up in the middle of the night and I couldn't breathe and I didn't know how to tell you because I didn't want to burden you. I didn't want to be the husband who was falling apart. I've always been the strong one and I couldn't let that go." We sat there for a long time and I listened, really listened. For the first time in months, maybe years, I listened without planning my response, without thinking about how his problems affected me, without trying to fix things. I just listened to my husband tell me about his depression, his anxiety, his feeling of being completely overwhelmed by life. He told me about his father's cancer diagnosis, about the guilt he felt for not being there enough, about the pressure he was putting on himself at work to prove he was worth the salary they were paying him, about the panic attacks that started a few months ago, the ones he'd been hiding by going into the bathroom with the shower running, about the sleepless nights, about the therapy he'd started 3 weeks ago as a last resort. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I swear I was going to tell you. I was trying to get myself together first so I could explain it in a way that didn't scare you." "I'm already scared," I said. "I've been scared for months because I could feel something was wrong, but I was too afraid to ask. I was too caught up in my own anxiety about losing you that I didn't see you were disappearing." We talked all night. We talked through the confusion and the hurt and the misunderstanding. We talked about how we'd let our marriage become transactional, how we'd stopped having real conversations and started just managing logistics, how we'd both become so focused on our own worries that we'd created this chasm between us. And we talked about what came next. Mark asked me if I wanted to go with him to his next therapy session. He said his therapist had suggested couples counseling, had been asking why I wasn't there, had been gently wondering if maybe I was part of the problem, not in a harsh way, but in the way that good therapists ask those questions. I said yes without hesitation. The first session was awkward. I sat in that same softlit office that I discovered by following my husband through the city, and I faced a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had kind eyes and a way of asking questions that made you want to answer honestly. She asked me why I was there. I told her the truth. I told her about finding out that my husband was in therapy by stalking him across town. I told her about the assumption I'd made about infidelity. I told her about the realization that followed. I told her about the conversation that came after. "That must have been a lot to process," Dr. Chen said. "It was," I replied. "It still is, but I think it might be the best thing that happened to us." She looked between Mark and me. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we were so disconnected that I could assume the worst about him and not even consider that he might be struggling. I mean that he was suffering so deeply that he couldn't even tell his wife about it. I mean that following him in a moment of panic might actually be the thing that finally cracked us open to the truth." Over the next few months, things slowly started to change. Mark continued his individual therapy. We started couples counseling. I learned things about my husband that I'd never known, and he learned things about me. We both learned things about ourselves. I learned that my anxiety about Mark leaving was rooted in my own childhood trauma, in a father who had actually left when I was young. I Ned, that I'd been unconsciously pushing Mark away to protect myself from that pain, that I'd built a marriage where vulnerability wasn't safe because I couldn't handle it. Mark learned that his depression had roots in perfectionism and people-pleasing that had been instilled in him from childhood. He learned that his silence was a learned behavior, a way of coping with a critical father who didn't accept weakness. He learned that keeping everything inside was slowly poisoning him. And we both learned that marriage, real marriage, isn't about being perfect for each other. It's about being willing to see each other's imperfections perfection and love each other anyway. 6 months after that night, I followed Mark across the city. We were different people. Not in a way that erased the hard parts or made everything suddenly easy, but in a way that felt real and sustainable. We had tools now. We had language. We had a safe space to be broken and know that we wouldn't be abandoned. Mark's father passed away 8 months after his diagnosis, and Mark grieved in a way that he never could have before. I was there for it, not trying to fix it, not trying to make it about me, just present, just witnessing his pain. And when I had a panic attack about money because I'd never shared my financial anxiety with him before, Mark was there. He held my hand. He didn't try to immediately solve it. He just stayed with me in it. We redecorated the living room where we'd had that first real conversation. We got rid of the couch we'd been sitting on, the one that felt like a museum piece to a time we'd rather forget. We bought new furniture that felt softer, more lived in. We made that space a place where difficult conversations could happen. I think about that night sometimes, about how close I came to destroying everything based on assumption and fear. I think about how different my life would be if I hadn't followed him. If I'd chosen to stay home and let the distance grow wider until one day we woke up as complete strangers. I think about how often we make that choice actually. How often we let our fears write the story of our relationships instead of asking questions. How often we assume the worst instead of believing in the best. How often we protect ourselves from vulnerability by creating the exact distance that leads to loneliness. The truth is, I still follow Mark sometimes, but it's not the stalking kind of following anymore. It's the kind where he tells me he's going to therapy and I believe him, where he asks if I want to go to couples counseling and I say yes, where we follow each other into the difficult places instead of running away. Mark tells people now when they ask that his wife saved his life. I tell him that he saved mine right back. The truth is probably that we saved each other, but we had to get lost first. We had to let the distance grow wide enough that we couldn't ignore it anymore. We had to hit the place where assumption and fear were stronger than hope, and then we had to choose differently. If you're in a marriage that feels distant, if you're noticing things changing, if there's been a shift towards silence and separation, I want to tell you something. It doesn't have to end in betrayal. It doesn't have to end in heartbreak, but it does require courage. It requires you to ask the hard questions instead of making up stories. It requires you to be willing to hear the truth even if it's not what you expected. Mark was struggling, he was drowning, and instead of pulling him down with assumptions and accusations, instead of making his pain about my fears, I finally learned to ask, what's really going on? That question changed everything. We're still in therapy. We probably always will be. Not because something is broken that needs fixing, but because healing is an ongoing practice. Because we've learned that vulnerability is not weakness. Because we've learned that the people we love the most deserve to know the truth about what we're feeling, even when that truth is messy and complicated. That Tuesday night, I followed my husband across the city thinking he was betraying me. He was, just not in the way I imagined. He was betraying our marriage by keeping his suffering secret, by protecting himself instead of trusting me with his broken pieces. And I was betraying it by being the kind of wife who made that silence feel necessary. But we found our way back. And if I could go back and talk to the woman sitting in that car, trailing her husband through the city, convinced that her world was ending, I would tell her this. The world you're afraid of is ending, but something better is going to be born from it. You're going to learn that love isn't about being perfect for each other. It's about being real with each other. And that realness, that honesty, that willingness to see and be seen is the most powerful thing that can exist between two people. The darkness you're about to walk into is actually going to be the tea. Hing that brings you into the light. Trust that, trust him, and most of all, ask the questions.